The scream came first, then the sound of glass breaking against tile. Elena Reyes dropped the jar of pickles she had been holding and grabbed the edge of the shelf to steady herself. Pain shot through her lower back and curled around her stomach like a fist tightening. She was 7 months pregnant, standing in the narrow snack aisle of Fenwick's grocery store, and for one terrifying second, she thought she was losing the baby right there on the cold floor. She breathed, in, out. The pain eased into a dull throb, the kind her doctor had warned her about, round ligament pain, nothing dangerous, just her body stretching to hold the life growing inside her. She pressed a hand to the small of her back and exhaled slowly, grateful the store was almost empty at this hour. Almost empty. Not quite. Elena? Elena Reyes, is that you? She knew the voice before she turned around. It scraped against something old and tender inside her chest, a wound she thought had scarred over months ago. She turned anyway, because pretending she hadn't heard him would only make this worse. Marcus Kellen stood at the end of the aisle, wearing a leather jacket that looked too expensive for a man who worked at his uncle's tire shop, his hair slicked back the way it always was when he wanted to look important. He had a phone in his hand, already lifting it, already filming, before she could even find words. "Whoa, whoa, look at you," he said, laughing, walking closer with the phone still raised. "You got fat." The words landed like a slap in the quiet store. A woman near the register turned her head. A teenage boy stocking cereal boxes froze with a can in his hand. Elena felt her face go hot, then cold, then hot again, the way it always did when shame arrived faster than she could stop it. She said nothing. She had promised herself, months ago, that Marcus Kellen would never again get the satisfaction of watching her cry. "I mean, damn," he went on, circling her slowly like she was an exhibit in a museum, his phone still recording. "What happened to you? You used to have a body. Now look at you. Who'd even want to?" "Marcus." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Stop." He didn't stop. He never did. That was the thing about Marcus. He mistook other people's silence for permission. "I'm just saying what everybody's thinking. You disappear for over a year. No calls, no nothing. And you come back looking like this? What? Did you find a whole bakery to move in with?" A few people near the front of the store had stopped pretending not to listen. Elena felt the heat crawling up her neck, felt her hands trembling at her sides, and still she said nothing, because giving Marcus a reaction was like feeding a fire more wood. What Marcus did not know, what he could not possibly know, standing there in his cheap confidence and his too-tight jacket, was that the child growing inside her did not belong to an ordinary man. The father of her son was not someone who worked a shift and came home tired. He was not someone who could be laughed at, filmed, or mocked without consequence. He was Cade Ashworth, and men far braver than Marcus Kellen had learned to lower their eyes in his presence. Elena did not know, at that exact moment, that Cade was less than 100 feet away. He had arrived in town only an hour earlier, driving himself instead of sending a car, because he wanted to see the streets Elena grew up on, wanted to understand the girl before she became the woman he loved. He had parked across from Fenwick's grocery store, simply because it was the closest place to stop and ask someone for directions to her old house. He had stepped out of the car and started walking toward the entrance, when he heard the raised voice through the propped open door. He heard the word fat. He heard the laughter. He heard Elena's silence. And something about that silence, about how carefully controlled it sounded, told him more than screaming ever could. Cade stopped just outside the door, in the shadow of the overhang, and watched through the glass. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than most men his age, with dark hair cut short, and a stillness to him that unsettled people even when he wasn't trying to unsettle them. His eyes, a deep amber brown that seemed to catch light differently than other eyes did, tracked every movement inside that store, cataloging the man circling his mate like a predator that had mistaken itself for the hunter. Every instinct in his body told him to walk through that door and end this in seconds. It would take almost nothing, one look, one word, and Marcus Kellen would understand exactly how small he was in the order of things. But Cade had learned patience over centuries of leading his people. He had learned that some fights belonged to the person who was being wronged, and that taking that fight away from them, even out of love, even out of protection, could be its own kind of insult. So he stood in the shadow of the doorway and watched, hands loose at his sides, jaw tight, and let Elena decide how this moment would end. Inside, Elena finally found her voice. "I'm not doing this with you," she said, and picked her dropped items off the floor, with hands that barely shook now. "You don't get to talk to me like this, not anymore." "Oh, come on," Marcus said, lowering the phone slightly, sensing he'd pushed far enough that people were starting to stare at him instead of her. "It's just a joke. Relax. You used to be able to take a joke." "I could always take a joke," Elena said, straightening up, meeting his eyes for the first time since he'd started filming. "This isn't a joke. This is you, trying to make yourself feel bigger by making me feel smaller. It didn't work when we were together, and it definitely doesn't work now." Something flickered across Marcus's face, an irritation he tried to cover with another laugh, but it came out thinner this time. "Whatever. I was just trying to say hi." "You said hi by filming me and insulting my body in the middle of a grocery store," Elena said. "That's not hi. That's cruelty with a camera." The teenage stockboy near the cereal aisle had stopped pretending to work entirely now, watching the exchange with wide eyes. The woman by the register had her phone half raised too, though whether to film in support of Elena or simply out of habit, no one could say. Marcus's jaw tightened. He glanced around, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on him, and the confidence that had carried him through the first minute of this encounter began to crack at the edges. "You always did think you were better than everyone," he muttered, "even back when you were with me." "I never thought I was better than everyone," Elena said quietly. "I just stopped thinking I had to be smaller for someone like you to feel comfortable." She turned and walked toward the register, her cart abandoned, leaving only the items she'd already paid for tucked under one arm. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, phone still in hand, the recording still running, capturing nothing now but his own stunned silence and the quiet murmur of onlookers, who had clearly taken Elena's side. Outside, in the shadow of the doorway, Cade allowed himself a slow breath. Pride moved through his chest, warm and fierce, watching the woman he loved stand her ground without needing him to stand it for her. But beneath the pride was something colder, something that coiled tight and did not release. Marcus Kellen had no idea what he had just done. Elena pushed through the exit door a moment later, blinking against the bright afternoon sun, still trembling slightly from adrenaline she refused to name as hurt. She took 2 steps before she saw him. Cade stood there, still as a statue carved from something older than stone, watching her, with an expression she had seen only a handful of times before, an expression that made grown men in his own pack take a step back without knowing why. "You heard that," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I heard all of it," Cade said, his voice low and even, though there was a current running beneath it, something restrained and dangerous. "You didn't need me in there." "No," Elena agreed, some of the tension easing from her shoulders now that she was near him. "I didn't. I'm glad," Cade said, and meant it, even as every part of him wanted to walk back through those doors and make sure Marcus Kellen understood, in a way words could not accomplish, exactly what kind of mistake he'd made. "But he doesn't get to speak to you that way again. Not while I'm breathing." Elena studied his face, the tight set of his jaw, the stillness that felt less like calm and more like a held breath. "Cade," she said carefully, "you promised me, no trouble. Not here, not with my family so close." "I promised you no trouble that you didn't choose," Cade said. "This isn't over, because you walked out of that store with your head high. It's only just beginning. People like him don't stop because they've been embarrassed once. They dig in. They get louder. And when he realizes exactly who you carry beneath your heart, Elena, he is going to want to use that against you." Elena's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, a protective gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past 7 months. "He doesn't know about you," she said. "Nobody here knows. Not yet," Cade agreed. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, close enough that the tightness in her chest began to loosen just from his nearness. "But this town will know soon enough who you are, and who our son will be. And when they know, men like Marcus Kellen will wish they had chosen their words more carefully." Inside the store, Marcus finally lowered his phone, aware that 6 strangers were now looking at him, with something between disgust and pity. He shoved the phone into his jacket pocket and muttered something about people being too sensitive these days, but his hands weren't quite steady when he reached for his own cart. He told himself Elena had always been dramatic, always turned simple observations into something bigger than they were. He told himself this as he pushed his cart toward the dairy section, refusing to look toward the front windows, refusing to acknowledge the tall figure standing beside his ex-girlfriend in the parking lot, a figure whose very presence seemed to bend the light around it. He had no way of knowing that the man outside was Cade Ashworth. He had no way of knowing that Cade led not a business or a small crew of workers, but an entire pack, one of the oldest and most powerful in the region, a pack whose name alone made rival leaders reconsider their plans. He had no way of knowing that insulting Elena Reyes in a grocery store had just placed him on a very short and very dangerous list. All Marcus knew was that his stomach felt uneasy, though he blamed it on the store's air conditioning rather than the cold weight of instinct trying to warn him. Outside, Elena let Cade guide her toward his car, one hand resting lightly against her lower back, careful and protective in a way that never once felt like control. "You're shaking," he murmured, opening the passenger door for her. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed the lie. "You don't have to be fine right now," Cade said, crouching slightly to meet her eyes as she settled into the seat. "You held your ground in there. That was strength, Elena. Real strength. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. But strength doesn't mean you can't feel the sting of what he said." Elena's eyes stung, unexpected and sudden, and she blinked hard against the emotion rising in her throat. "I told myself I wouldn't let him get to me," she whispered. "I told myself I was past caring what Marcus Kellen thinks of me." "You are past it," Cade said gently. "What happened in there wasn't you caring what he thinks. It was you remembering how it used to feel when someone you trusted turned cruelty into a habit. That's not weakness. That's a scar, reacting to an old wound being pressed." She let out a shaky breath, some of the fight draining out of her now that she didn't have to hold herself together for an audience. "I used to think I loved him," she admitted quietly. "Before you, before everything changed, I used to think what we had was real." "It doesn't matter what it was before," Cade said, closing her door gently and rounding the car to the driver's side. He slid in beside her, started the engine, but didn't pull away yet. Instead, he turned to look at her fully, his amber eyes steady and warm, despite the storm that had moved through him minutes earlier. "What matters is what you are now. A woman who stood in front of a man who tried to shame her and refused to shrink. A woman carrying my son, who will grow up knowing his mother never once let cruelty define her." Elena managed a small, tired smile. "You always know exactly what to say." "I know exactly what's true," Cade corrected softly. "There's a difference." As he pulled the car out of the parking lot, Elena glanced once more toward the grocery store's front windows, where she could just make out Marcus's silhouette near the registers, oblivious to how close he had come to learning a lesson he would not have enjoyed. She turned away, resting her head back against the seat, one hand still cradling her stomach. She did not know yet how quickly word would spread through town, how many versions of this story would circulate by nightfall, each one growing a little stranger, a little more exaggerated, until half the town believed something dramatic had nearly happened in Fenwick's grocery store that afternoon. She did not know that among those retelling the story would be people who had once known her only as the quiet girl who left town without explanation, and who would soon learn there was far more to her disappearance than heartbreak. She only knew that her back still ached faintly, that her son shifted inside her, as though sensing her exhaustion, and that beside her sat a man who would burn down the world before letting anyone make her feel small again. Marcus Kellen, meanwhile, finished his shopping in a hurry, suddenly eager to leave the store. He told himself the unsettled feeling crawling up his spine was nothing, just the leftover adrenaline of an argument he'd clearly won, at least in his own mind. He did not see the black car pulling smoothly out of the parking lot. He did not notice the way 3 separate strangers in the store had already begun typing out the story to send to friends, framing him as the villain of an encounter he still believed he had handled with humor. He had no idea that his name had just been noted, quietly and permanently, by a man whose memory did not forgive easily. He would learn soon enough. Everyone in town would. But for now, the afternoon sun continued its slow crawl across the sky, indifferent to the storm quietly gathering beneath it, and Elena Reyes rode away from the grocery store beside the father of her child, her heartbeat finally slowing, unaware that this was only the first spark of a fire that would soon reshape everything she thought she knew about her hometown, her past, and the future waiting to claim her. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills outside town, Elena Reyes sat curled on the porch swing of her childhood home, a mug of untouched tea cooling in her hands. The wooden boards creaked beneath her as she rocked slowly, watching the sky shift from gold to a deep bruised purple. Cade had gone inside to speak quietly with her mother, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts for the first time all day. She let her mind drift back, unwillingly, to the night everything changed. It had been raining that night, hard enough that the roads outside the city had turned to rivers of mud. Elena had been driving home from her cousin's engagement party, exhausted and a little too proud to admit she was lost after taking a wrong turn onto an unfamiliar back road. Her car had stalled halfway across a narrow bridge, engine flooding, headlights flickering weakly against the downpour. She remembered the fear first, the isolation of being stranded in the dark with no phone signal, and no idea how far the nearest town was. Then she remembered the sound, low and rolling like distant thunder, except it hadn't come from the sky, it had come from the tree line. Men had emerged from the woods on either side of the road, moving with a speed and silence that no ordinary person could match. She had frozen, certain she was about to become the victim of every warning her mother had ever given her about driving alone at night. But the men hadn't approached her car. They had formed a loose perimeter around it instead, watching the trees, watching the shadows, as though guarding her from something she couldn't see. Then Cade had appeared. He'd stepped out of the darkness like he belonged to it, calm in a way that made no sense given the chaos of the storm, and had approached her window with his hands visible, his voice steady. He told her later that her scent alone had drawn him from over a mile away, that something in him had recognized her before he understood why, the way a compass needle finds north without needing to be told. At the time, she'd only known that a stranger with unsettling amber eyes had gotten her car running again in under 2 minutes, had refused to let her drive the rest of the way alone, and had followed her taillights all the way into town without once asking for anything in return. She hadn't known, that first night, that she had just crossed paths with the alpha king of the Ashworth pack, a man whose name carried more weight in certain circles than the mayors of entire cities. She hadn't known that packs like his existed at all, hidden in plain sight, governing themselves by laws far older than the ones printed in any courthouse. She learned slowly, over the weeks that followed. Cade had not rushed her. He had let her ease into the truth the way a person eases into cold water, one careful step at a time, giving her the chance to walk away at any point if the weight of his world became too heavy to carry. It never had. What she learned instead was that Cade led his people not through fear, though fear certainly followed him, but through a fierce and steady sense of responsibility. He settled disputes between families, with patience most humans never extended, even to their closest friends. He protected his territory not out of hunger for power, but out of a deep, almost exhausting sense of duty, the kind carried by someone who had never once been allowed to imagine a life without it. Their bond, when it formed, had not been planned. Packs like his followed old laws, and one of the oldest forbade an alpha from choosing a mate outside the bloodlines of established packs. A human mate was almost unheard of, whispered about in old stories, more than seen in living memory. Elena had asked him once, quietly, lying beside him in the dark, whether loving her would cost him everything he'd built. Cade had answered without hesitation. "It already has," he'd said, "and I would pay that price again in every lifetime, if it meant keeping you." She thought of that conversation now, rocking gently on the porch swing, one hand resting against the curve of her stomach, where their son continued to grow. She thought of how much had changed since that stormy night on the bridge, how the quiet, uncertain woman who'd once been mocked and eventually abandoned by Marcus Kellen had slowly become someone capable of standing in a grocery store aisle and refusing to shrink beneath cruel words. She had left town almost a year ago, not out of fear, but out of love. Pack politics were dangerous in ways she hadn't fully understood until she'd lived among them. Rival packs had begun testing Cade's authority almost as soon as their relationship became known within his inner circle, probing for weaknesses, searching for leverage. Elena, human and unprotected by the old laws, had become exactly that leverage in the eyes of certain enemies. Cade had asked her to stay hidden, not because he doubted her strength, but because he refused to gamble with her safety, while war games played out among packs who valued power over mercy. She had agreed, reluctantly, moving into a quiet house on the edge of his territory, watched over by guards who never let her out of sight, waiting out months of tension while Cade worked to secure peace treaties that would finally make it safe for her to return home. The pregnancy had come as a surprise to them both, though not an unwelcome one. If anything, it had deepened Cade's resolve, sharpened his focus during negotiations that dragged through long, tense weeks. An heir changed everything. It gave rival packs new reasons to plot, but it also gave Cade new leverage of his own, a living symbol of an alliance that could no longer be dismissed as a passing infatuation. Elena had spent the final months of her pregnancy watching Cade grow more determined, more careful, more protective, until finally, 3 weeks ago, he had come to her with news that peace, however fragile, had been secured. It was safe, he told her, to come home. Safe enough, at least, for a visit. She hadn't expected her homecoming to include a confrontation with Marcus in a grocery store aisle, but looking back now, she realized it made a strange kind of sense. Marcus had always been the kind of man who noticed change in others and felt threatened by it, who mistook other people's growth as an insult to his own stagnation. Of course he would notice the changes in her. Of course he would try to twist them into something small and cruel, because that was the only language he'd ever really understood. The screen door creaked open behind her, and Cade stepped out onto the porch, 2 fresh mugs of tea balanced carefully in his hands. He handed her one, taking the cold, forgotten mug from her fingers and setting it aside. "Your mother likes me," he said, settling onto the swing beside her, careful not to rock it too hard. "My mother would like anyone who looks at me the way you do," Elena said, allowing herself a small smile. She spent the last year worried I'd end up alone forever after everything with Marcus. "She doesn't need to worry about that anymore," Cade said quietly. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the porch light casting a soft golden glow against the deepening night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Elena let her head rest against Cade's shoulder, feeling the tension of the day slowly bleed out of her. "Tomorrow," Cade said eventually, "I want to walk through town with you. Properly. Not hiding, not sneaking around back roads to avoid attention." Elena lifted her head, studying his face in the dim light. "You know what that means, don't you? Half this town already saw what happened today. If you walk beside me tomorrow, in the open, people are going to ask questions. Marcus is going to ask questions." "Let him ask," Cade said, and there was something in his voice, calm but unyielding, that told Elena the decision had already been made. "I am done watching from doorways and shadows, while people who don't deserve your time try to make you feel small. Our son deserves to grow up knowing his mother was never hidden, never something to be ashamed of. He deserves a mother who walked through her own hometown with her head high, beside the man who loves her, without fear of what small men like Marcus Kellen think." Elena's throat tightened, with an emotion too complicated to name, gratitude and love, and a lingering thread of fear, all tangled together. "It won't just be Marcus who notices," she said softly. "If people start asking who you are, really asking, it won't stay a small-town secret for long. Word travels, you know that better than anyone." "I know," Cade agreed, "and I've already accounted for that. My people are aware I'm here. Preparations have been made in case word spreads faster than we'd like. You are not walking into this unprotected, Elena. You never will again." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of hesitation, any flicker of doubt about the path he was choosing. She found none, only the same steady certainty that had first drawn her to him on that rain-soaked bridge, the sense that whatever storm came next, he would stand in front of it without flinching. "Okay," she said finally, "tomorrow, together." Cade reached over and laced his fingers through hers, his thumb tracing a slow, absent circle against her knuckles. "Together," he echoed. Inside the house, through the thin walls, Elena's mother moved quietly from window to window, drawing curtains against the coming night, humming an old tune under her breath, as though the world outside hadn't just shifted on its axis. She had welcomed Cade with open arms that afternoon, some instinct older than reason recognizing in him a kind of steadiness she'd always hoped some man would offer her daughter. She didn't know the full truth yet, not the details of pacts and old laws and rival territories testing each other's strength in the dark. She only knew her daughter had come home changed, stronger somehow, carrying herself with a quiet confidence Elena had never quite possessed before she left. Whatever this man had given her daughter, whatever storm they had weathered together to arrive at this porch, this night, this fragile peace, her mother was grateful for it. Across town, in a cramped apartment above his uncle's tire shop, Marcus Kellen sat scrolling through his phone, replaying the video he'd recorded earlier that day. He watched himself laugh, watched Elena's carefully controlled expression, and told himself again that he'd done nothing wrong. Just a joke. Just an observation. People were too sensitive. But every time he watched the video, that same uneasy feeling crept back into his stomach, the one he couldn't quite explain, the one that had followed him out of the grocery store like a shadow with a mind of its own. He didn't know why. He told himself it didn't matter. He would learn tomorrow exactly why his instincts had been trying to warn him. For now, he deleted the video, telling himself he was simply tired of looking at it, and went to bed with the uneasy feeling still curled tight in his chest, refusing to be ignored no matter how hard he tried to push it away. Morning arrived with a clean, washed light spilling over the rooftops of Elena's hometown, and by the time she stepped out onto the porch, she found Cade already dressed, already waiting, a quiet readiness in his posture that reminded her, not for the first time, that he was a man used to walking into rooms that expected him to command them. "You look nervous," he said, tilting his head as she joined him on the steps. "I look pregnant, and about to walk through the middle of town on purpose," Elena corrected. "There's a difference." Cade's mouth curved into the smallest smile, one she'd learned to treasure, because it appeared so rarely, and meant so much when it did. "Then let them see exactly that, a woman carrying new life, unashamed, unafraid." They walked together down Maple Street, past the hardware store with its faded awning, past the bakery that had been there since Elena was a child, its windows still fogged with the scent of fresh bread. Heads turned as they passed, whispers followed, quiet at first, curious rather than cruel, though Elena felt every glance like a small weight settling against her shoulders. She had expected the attention. What she hadn't expected was how differently people looked at Cade, not with the casual curiosity reserved for a stranger, but with something closer to instinct, an unconscious recognition that this was not an ordinary man walking beside her. Store owners who normally called out friendly greetings to passers-by fell quiet as they approached, offering polite nods instead, their eyes lingering a beat too long on Cade's face, before dropping respectfully away. "They can feel it," Cade murmured, noticing her confusion. "Not consciously. Most humans can't name what they sense in a room with someone like me, but their bodies understand hierarchy even when their minds don't have the words for it." Elena thought of Marcus, of his loud confidence yesterday in the grocery store, and wondered how his instincts would react when he finally stood face to face with Cade. She didn't have to wonder long. They were passing the small town square, where a farmer's market had set up its usual weekend stalls, when Elena heard her name called from somewhere behind them. She recognized the voice immediately, and her stomach tightened. "Elena, hey, wait up." Marcus jogged toward them, weaving between market stalls, apparently having spotted her from across the square. He slowed as he got closer, his easy grin faltering slightly, when his eyes landed on the man standing beside her. Something crossed his face, quick and involuntary, an instinctive flicker of unease that he tried immediately to cover with bravado. "Didn't expect to see you out and about again so soon," Marcus said, forcing a laugh that came out thinner than he intended. His eyes flicked toward Cade, taking in the height, the stillness, the quiet authority radiating off him like heat from a fire. "Who's your friend?" "This is Cade," Elena said simply, deciding not to offer more than necessary. "Cade, this is Marcus." "I know who he is," Cade said, his voice calm, almost pleasant, though there was an edge beneath it that made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck rise, without him understanding why. "We haven't officially met, but I was present yesterday, outside the store." Marcus's grin faded another degree. "Outside the store," he repeated slowly, some instinct warning him that this piece of information mattered more than it should. "So you saw all that?" "Look, that was just a joke between old friends, nothing serious." "Old friends don't film each other while mocking their bodies in public," Cade said, still calm, still pleasant, and somehow that calmness was more unsettling than anger would have been. "But I'm not here to relitigate yesterday. I'm here because Elena wanted to walk through her hometown without hiding, and I intend to make sure she's able to do exactly that, today and every day after. Marcus's eyes darted between Elena and Cade, some slow understanding beginning to dawn behind his expression, though he couldn't yet name what exactly he was understanding. Okay, he said carefully. I didn't realize you two were, together. We are, Elena said, and we're expecting a son. The words landed with more weight than she expected them to. Marcus's face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, then something like calculation, then finally something that looked almost like fear, though he tried immediately to smother it beneath another forced laugh. Congratulations, I guess, he said, though the words came out hollow. Didn't take you long to move on, huh? I didn't move on, Elena said evenly. I moved forward. There's a difference, Marcus, though I don't expect you to understand it. A small crowd had begun to gather at the edges of the market stalls, drawn by the tension crackling in the air, though most pretended to be absorbed in examining vegetables or bread while straining to listen. Marcus seemed to notice the audience too, and something in him hardened, some old instinct to save face in front of witnesses. You know, he said, his voice rising slightly, an attempt to reclaim the confidence that had drained out of him moments before. I always figured you'd end up with someone like this. Someone rich, someone who could sweep in and make you forget how things really were. How things really were, Elena repeated slowly. Was you leaving me the moment things got difficult? Was you disappearing for 3 days without a word when I needed you most? That's how things really were, Marcus. I haven't forgotten. I just stopped letting it define me. Cade remained silent through this exchange, though his stillness had taken on a coiled, waiting quality, like a held breath. He had promised Elena this fight belonged to her, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter how badly some deeper, more primal part of him wanted to close the distance between himself and Marcus Kellen, and remind the man exactly what kind of danger he had wandered into. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, some cutting remark clearly forming, but whatever he saw in Cade's expression in that moment made the words die in his throat. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something colder, something patient, the look of a predator that had decided its prey wasn't worth the effort yet, but was cataloging every word for later. Whatever, Marcus muttered instead, taking a step back. Have a nice life, Elena, both of you. He turned and walked quickly back through the market stalls, his earlier swagger noticeably absent from his stride. Elena watched him go, feeling something settle in her chest that felt almost like relief, though tinged still with the old, familiar ache of a wound reopened. You didn't need to say anything, she told Cade quietly, once Marcus had disappeared around the corner of the bakery. You just stood there, and he still looked like he wanted to run. That's the difference between confidence and true strength, Cade said, guiding her gently toward an empty bench at the edge of the square. Confidence needs an audience to survive. Strength doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. He sensed that difference the moment he stood in front of me, even if he couldn't name it. They sat together for a while, watching the market continue its slow rhythm around them, vendors calling out prices, children weaving between stalls with fistfuls of coins. Elena felt the tension of the confrontation slowly draining out of her shoulders, replaced by something steadier, something that felt almost like peace. Thank you, she said eventually, for letting me handle him myself, for not stepping in, even when I know you wanted to. You didn't need me to fight your battles, Elena, Cade said, turning to look at her, his expression softening in a way it rarely did in front of others. You've never needed that. What you needed was someone standing beside you, who believed you were capable of winning them on your own. That's a different kind of support than most people understand. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the market continue its unbothered rhythm, unaware that word of the confrontation was already spreading through town, faster than either of them realized. By afternoon, 3 separate versions of the story would be circulating, each one adding new details, new drama, until the truth became almost unrecognizable beneath the layers of small-town gossip. But underneath all the exaggeration, one detail remained consistent in every retelling. Marcus Kellen had walked away from that confrontation, looking smaller than anyone in town had ever seen him look before. Across the square, hidden partially behind a fruit stall, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a notepad full of the week's shopping list watched the entire exchange unfold with growing interest. Her name was Grace Whitfield, And she had lived in this town longer than almost anyone, had watched 3 generations of families grow and change and sometimes fall apart. She had also, quietly and without any of her neighbors realizing it, spent decades studying the old stories about pacts and territories that most people dismissed as folklore. She recognized something in the tall stranger standing beside Elena Reyes, something in his stillness, his bearing, the way the crowd around him had instinctively given him space without understanding why. She had seen that quality only once before, decades ago, in stories her own grandmother used to tell about the old families who ruled the forests beyond the county line. Grace tucked her notepad into her bag and made her way slowly back toward her car, her mind already turning over questions she intended to answer before the week was out. Whatever Elena Reyes had brought back into this town, Grace suspected it was far bigger and far more dangerous than anyone else here understood yet. She had no intention of causing trouble, but she had every intention of watching, carefully, from the shadows, because some instinct deep and old told her that trouble was already on its way to this quiet town, whether anyone wanted it or not. 3 days after the encounter at the market, Marcus Kellen sat in the back office of his uncle's tire shop, staring at his phone, with a growing sense of dread he couldn't quite explain. His uncle Owen had asked him twice already why he seemed so distracted, and twice Marcus had waved off the question, unwilling to admit that something about the stranger named Cade had lodged itself under his skin like a splinter he couldn't remove. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself 100 times over the past few days that the tall man was just some rich boyfriend Elena had picked up, someone with money and confidence, who happened to make Marcus feel small in a way he wasn't used to feeling. That explanation had worked well enough at first, until the whispers started. It began with small comments from customers at the shop, people mentioning offhand that they'd heard Elena Reyes had come back to town with someone important, someone connected to old money, or old power. Nobody seemed entirely sure which. Then came a comment from his cousin Lily, who worked at the diner on Main Street, mentioning that 2 men in dark suits had come in asking quiet questions about the Reyes family, questions that seemed less like curiosity and more like careful research. Marcus had laughed it off at the time, but the laughter felt hollow now, sitting alone in the cramped office, turning the strange, unsettled feeling over in his mind, like a stone he couldn't stop touching. He decided, against his better judgment, to ask around. His first stop was Grace Whitfield, the old woman who ran the antique shop on the corner of Elm and 4th. Everyone in town knew Grace had a memory like a filing cabinet, and a habit of collecting stories most people had forgotten. If anyone knew something about the mysterious stranger who'd shown up beside Elena, it would be her. He found her sweeping the front step of her shop when he arrived, and she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and quiet judgment. "Marcus Kellen," she said, not unkindly, though there was an edge beneath her tone. "Heard you made quite a spectacle of yourself at the grocery store the other day." Marcus felt his face heat. "That's actually why I'm here," he said, deciding honesty, or at least a version of it, might get him further than pretending everything was fine. "That guy with Elena, Cade, you know anything about him?" Grace's broom stilled against the step. She studied Marcus for a long moment, the kind of look that made him feel like a child again, caught doing something he shouldn't have. "Why do you want to know?" "Because everyone's acting weird about him," Marcus admitted. "People are asking questions. Strangers are showing up in town asking about the Reyes family. And every time I think about the way that guy looked at me, I get this feeling I can't shake. Like I made a mistake I don't understand yet." Something shifted in Grace's expression, a decision made behind careful eyes. She set her broom against the shop's doorframe and gestured for him to follow her inside, toward the back room, where she kept her oldest, least valuable stock, the pieces too worn or strange to sell to ordinary customers. "Sit," she said, pulling out an old wooden chair from behind a cluttered desk. Marcus obeyed, watching as she moved to a locked drawer and retrieved a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. "My grandmother used to tell stories," Grace began, settling into the chair across from him. "Stories about families who lived beyond the county line, in the old forests nobody built roads through. Families who weren't quite like the rest of us, stronger, faster, bound by laws older than any government we've ever known." Marcus felt a chill crawl up his spine, despite the warmth of the small back room. "You're talking about, what, folklore? Fairy tales?" I'm talking about things people used to know were true, before television and cell phones convinced everyone that anything they couldn't photograph didn't exist, Grace said sharply. My grandmother saw one of them once, when she was a girl. Said the man's eyes weren't quite human. Said the ground seemed to hold its breath when he walked past. She called them alphas, kings of packs that governed themselves by rules none of us were ever meant to understand. Marcus's mouth had gone dry. He thought of Cade's stillness in the market square, the way the crowd had instinctively parted around him, the way his own instincts had screamed at him to look away, to apologize, to run, even though nothing about the encounter had been overtly threatening. You think that's what he is? Marcus said slowly. You think Elena's boyfriend is some kind of, what, wolf king? I think, Grace said carefully, that you should be very, very careful about what you say to that young woman from now on. Whatever Elena Reyes brought back into this town, it isn't something you want to provoke further. My grandmother's stories all ended the same way. Men who disrespected an alpha's mate rarely got the chance to make the same mistake twice. Marcus sat frozen in the small back room for a long moment, the old journal's brittle pages seeming to whisper warnings he desperately wanted to dismiss as nonsense. Every rational part of his mind insisted this was absurd, an old woman's fading memory of childhood stories, nothing more. But the unsettled feeling in his stomach, the one that had followed him since the moment he'd first looked into Cade's eyes, refused to be reasoned away. What am I supposed to do with this? He asked finally, his voice smaller than he intended. Apologize, Grace said simply. Genuinely, not for show, and then stay as far away from Elena Reyes as you possibly can. Whatever pride you think you're protecting isn't worth whatever that man is capable of, if he decides you're a threat worth addressing. Marcus left the antique shop with his mind spinning, the warm afternoon sun doing nothing to ease the cold knot forming in his chest. He walked slowly through town, past the diner, past the hardware store, replaying every interaction he'd had with Elena and Cade over the past few days, searching for some detail that might prove Grace's old stories were exactly that. Stories, nothing more. He found no such reassurance. Instead, he found himself remembering small details he'd dismissed at the time, the way Cade's eyes had seemed to catch light strangely in the market square, the impossible stillness of his posture, as though he could stand motionless for hours without discomfort, the way every person in the crowd had instinctively lowered their voices and averted their eyes the moment he'd walked past, an unconscious deference that made no logical sense for a stranger nobody in town actually knew. By the time Marcus reached his apartment above the tire shop, he had convinced himself, against every rational instinct, that Grace Whitfield's old stories might hold more truth than he wanted to admit. And if they did, if Cade truly was what Grace's grandmother had once glimpsed in the old forests beyond the county line, then Marcus understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, exactly how close he had come to real danger in that grocery store aisle. He sat on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, staring at Elena's contact information, still saved from months ago when they'd still spoken occasionally after their breakup. His thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment, before he set the phone aside, deciding a call wasn't enough. If he was going to apologize, truly apologize, it needed to be in person, needed to carry enough weight, to convince both Elena and the man beside her that he understood, finally, exactly how badly he'd misjudged the situation. He didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the old building, every distant sound from the street below, sent his mind spiraling back to Grace's warnings, to old stories about alphas who protected what belonged to them, with a ferocity no ordinary man could match. Across town, in the quiet house on the edge of Elena's family property, Cade sat awake long after Elena had fallen asleep beside him, his mind turning over reports that had arrived that evening from his second-in-command back home. Rival pack activity had increased near the northern border, subtle probing that suggested someone was testing whether Cade's attention, divided now between his territory and Elena's hometown, had created a weakness worth exploiting. He hadn't told Elena yet, unwilling to add worry to a homecoming that should have been simple and joyful, but the reports troubled him, a low, persistent hum of concern beneath his otherwise steady composure. Peace, he understood now, was rarely as permanent as anyone hoped it might be. He glanced down at Elena, sleeping peacefully beside him, one hand curled protectively over the curve of her stomach even in sleep, and felt his resolve harden into something unshakable. Whatever threats gathered on the horizon, near or far, human or otherwise, he would meet them before they ever came close enough to touch her. Marcus Kellen's apology, whenever it came, would be the least of the challenges still waiting to unfold. Marcus arrived at the Reyes house the following afternoon, his hands sweating despite the mild autumn weather, a small bouquet of flowers clutched awkwardly in one fist. He had debated the flowers for nearly an hour at the grocery store, unsure whether they would seem like a genuine gesture or a pathetic attempt to buy forgiveness. But in the end, he'd bought them anyway, unwilling to arrive empty-handed for what he suspected might be the most important apology of his life. He knocked twice before the door opened, and his stomach dropped when he saw Cade standing there instead of Elena, filling the doorway with a quiet, unreadable calm that made every instinct in Marcus's body want to turn and walk away. "Marcus," Cade said, his tone giving away nothing. I came to talk to Elena," Marcus stammered, gripping the flowers a little tighter. "If that's okay. I wanted to apologize. Properly, this time." Cade studied him for a long moment, long enough that Marcus felt sweat gathering at the back of his neck, despite the cool breeze drifting across the porch. Finally, Cade stepped back, gesturing him inside. "She's in the kitchen. I'll let her decide whether she wants to hear what you have to say." Marcus followed him through the familiar hallway, memories of visits here years ago flickering uncomfortably at the edges of his mind, memories of a version of himself that felt like a stranger now. Elena stood at the kitchen counter, slicing vegetables for dinner, and looked up in surprise when she saw him standing in the doorway. "Marcus," she said, setting down the knife carefully. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," he said quickly, before his nerve could fail him entirely. "For what I said at the store, for filming you, for all of it. I was cruel, and I knew I was being cruel while I was doing it, and I told myself it was just a joke, because that was easier than admitting I was jealous." Elena's eyebrows rose slightly at the admission. Jealous of what exactly? Marcus glanced briefly at Cade, who had positioned himself near the doorway, arms crossed, watching the exchange with careful attention. "Jealous that you moved on, and became someone stronger than I ever helped you become," Marcus admitted, the words coming easier now that he'd started. "Jealous that some part of me always knew I didn't deserve someone like you, and instead of fixing that, I tried to make you feel small so I wouldn't have to face it." The kitchen fell silent for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant call of birds outside the window. Elena studied Marcus carefully, searching his face for any hint of insincerity, any trace of the performance he'd put on in the grocery store days earlier. She found, to her surprise, something that looked genuinely close to shame. "I appreciate you saying that," she said finally, her voice softer than it had been in days. "But an apology doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't erase the year you disappeared when I needed support, and it doesn't erase what you said in front of half the town." "I know," Marcus said quickly. "I'm not asking you to forget it. I just needed you to know I understand now, finally, how wrong I was. All of it. Not just the joke at the store, but everything before that too." Cade remained silent throughout the exchange, though Elena could feel his attention like a physical presence in the room, steady and watchful. She glanced toward him briefly, and something passed between them, an unspoken understanding that this moment belonged entirely to her. "Thank you for apologizing," she said finally, turning back to Marcus. "I mean that. It takes something to admit you were wrong, especially in front of an audience." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Cade before returning to Marcus. "But I need you to understand something too. This isn't about earning my forgiveness so you can feel better about yourself. This is about you actually changing, becoming someone who doesn't need to make others small in order to feel secure." "I understand," Marcus said, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, his voice carried none of its usual bravado, none of the performance he typically wore like armor. "I don't expect us to be friends again. I don't expect anything, really. I just needed to say this before I let more time pass." Elena nodded slowly, some of the tension in her shoulders finally easing. "I accept your apology, Marcus. I hope you mean it, and I hope you carry it forward into how you treat people going forward, not just me." Marcus set the bouquet of flowers awkwardly on the kitchen counter, unsure what else to do with them now that the moment had passed. "I should go," he said. "I just wanted to say what I came to say." He turned toward the door, and Cade stepped aside to let him pass, though his eyes tracked Marcus's every movement with quiet, unwavering attention. At the threshold, Marcus paused, glancing back once more. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I hope you're happy. Both of you. And your son." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the porch steps and along the walkway toward his car. Elena watched him go through the kitchen window, feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering sadness. The closing of a chapter she hadn't fully realized she needed closed. "You didn't have to accept his apology," Cade said quietly, moving to stand beside her at the window. "I know," Elena said, "but holding on to anger doesn't hurt him, Cade. It only hurts me. I'd rather let it go and focus on what actually matters now." She placed a hand over her stomach, feeling the familiar flutter of movement beneath her palm. "Our son, our family, whatever comes next." Cade wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her gently against his side. "Whatever comes next," he agreed, though his mind lingered briefly on the reports from the northern border, the quiet gathering of tension. He hadn't yet found the words to share with her. News of Marcus's apology spread through town almost as quickly as news of the original confrontation had, though this version of the story carried a different tone, one of quiet redemption rather than public spectacle. Grace Whitfield heard about it from a customer at her shop and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, relieved that her warning had apparently found its mark. She still watched the Reyes house more carefully than usual over the following days, though unable to shake the feeling that whatever quiet peace had settled over the town wouldn't last much longer. Old instincts, sharpened by decades of half-remembered stories, told her that trouble rarely stayed away for long once it had found a reason to notice a place. She was right to trust that instinct. 3 days after Marcus's apology, a black sedan with tinted windows rolled slowly into town, parking outside the small diner on Main Street. 2 men stepped out, dressed in dark, tailored suits that looked distinctly out of place among the town's usual flannel and denim. They moved with a controlled, deliberate grace that immediately caught the attention of anyone paying close enough attention. The same unnerving stillness Grace had noticed in Cade weeks earlier, though colder somehow, sharper around the edges. They asked quiet questions at the diner, at the hardware store, at the small gas station on the edge of town, always circling back to the same subject, the whereabouts of Cade Ashworth, and the woman he had been seen with in recent weeks. Word reached Cade by early evening, carried by one of his own men stationed quietly at the edges of town, watching for exactly this kind of intrusion. Cade's expression darkened as he listened to the report, his earlier calm replaced by something colder, more focused. "They found us faster than I expected," he said quietly, once the report had finished, and Elena had joined him in the kitchen, sensing the shift in his mood immediately. "Who found us?" Elena asked, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "Scouts," Cade said grimly. "From a rival pack. I'd hoped the peace treaties would hold long enough to keep this place hidden from them, at least until after our son is born. It seems I was too optimistic." Elena felt a cold thread of fear tighten in her chest, though she forced her voice to remain steady. "What do we do now?" Cade turned to face her fully, his expression softening slightly despite the tension still radiating off him. "Now," he said, "we prepare. I won't let anyone bring danger to this house, to your family, to our son. But we can't pretend the peace we've built is as solid as we hoped it was." Outside, the black sedan pulled slowly away from the diner, its tinted windows giving no hint of the conversation happening within, as it turned onto the road leading toward the edge of town, toward the quiet house where Elena Reyes had finally begun to feel safe again. By nightfall, Cade's men had quietly taken up positions around the perimeter of the Reyes property, blending into the tree line and the shadows between houses so completely that even Elena's mother, moving through her kitchen preparing a late dinner, never noticed the extra eyes watching over her home. Cade paced the length of the living room, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, clipped tones to someone back at his territory. Elena sat on the couch, watching him with growing unease, catching fragments of the conversation, references to the northern border, to a name she didn't recognize, Damon Voss, spoken with a weight that made her stomach tighten each time it came up. When Cade finally ended the call, he sat down heavily beside her, rubbing a hand across his face, in a rare display of visible exhaustion. "Tell me," Elena said quietly. "All of it. I'm not a child who needs to be protected from information, Cade. I'm carrying your son." I deserve to understand what we're facing. Cade was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. Damon Voss leads a pack to the north of my territory, he said finally. For years, our packs maintained an uneasy peace, more out of mutual exhaustion than genuine goodwill. But Voss has always resented the size of my territory, the strength of my alliances. When word spread that I had chosen a human mate, one outside the old bloodlines, he saw it as an opportunity. An opportunity for what? Elena asked. To challenge my authority, Cade said. Under the old laws, a mate chosen outside, approved bloodlines, can be seen as a vulnerability, a crack in an alpha's standing that rivals can exploit. Voss has been testing that crack for months, probing our borders, spreading doubt among smaller allied packs. Now that he knows where to find you, where our son will be born, he has a target he believes will force my hand. Elena felt the fear tighten further in her chest, though beneath it, something steadier began to rise, a determination she hadn't expected to find so readily. So what does he want? To hurt me? To hurt our son? I don't believe he intends violence, not directly, Cade said carefully. Voss is calculating, not reckless. More likely, he hopes to use your presence, your vulnerability, as a human, unprotected by the old laws, to force a confrontation on his terms, somewhere he holds the advantage. If he can provoke me into acting rashly, into abandoning careful diplomacy for open conflict, it gives him grounds to rally other packs against me, painting me as unstable, unfit to lead. Elena absorbed this, her mind working quickly despite the fear still humming beneath her ribs. So the scouts today, the men in the suits, they weren't here to hurt me. They were here to confirm I exist, to confirm where I am. Exactly, Cade said, something like reluctant pride flickering across his face at her quick understanding, which means we have a choice to make. We can retreat, return you to the protected territory where Voss's reach is weaker, and wait out this period of tension in relative safety. Or we can stay, and make it clear, publicly and unmistakably, that you are not a vulnerability to be exploited, but a strength this pack stands firmly behind. Elena was quiet for a long moment, thinking of Marcus, of the grocery store, of the moment she had chosen to stand her ground, rather than shrink beneath cruel words. She thought of her mother in the next room, humming softly as she prepared dinner, unaware of the danger gathering at the edges of the life her daughter had built. She thought of her son, growing steadily within her, who would one day need to understand that his mother had never once run from a fight worth having. I don't want to hide, she said finally, her voice steady, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. I spent months hiding already, Cade. Kept away from my own home because it wasn't safe. I understand why, and I don't regret it, but I won't do it again, unless there's no other choice. If Voss wants to see whether I'm a weakness, let him see exactly how wrong he is. Cade studied her for a long moment, something fierce and proud moving behind his amber eyes. You understand what staying means, he said carefully. It means Voss may escalate, may test our resolve further before this is resolved. It won't be comfortable, Elena. It may not even be entirely safe. Nothing about carrying the heir to an Alpha King was ever going to be entirely safe, Elena said, a small, tired smile touching her lips despite the tension of the conversation. I knew that the moment I chose to stay with you. I'm not backing down now. Cade leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, lingering there for a long moment, breathing in the familiar warmth of her presence, as though grounding himself against the storm gathering on the horizon. Then we stay, he said quietly, and we prepare properly, this time. No more scouts slipping through unnoticed. No more assumptions that peace will hold simply because we want it to. Over the following days, the quiet town around the Reyes house began to feel subtly different, though most residents couldn't have said exactly why. Cars they didn't recognize passed through more frequently, their drivers polite but distant, their eyes sharp and watchful in ways that unsettled shopkeepers who prided themselves on knowing every face in town. Grace Whitfield noticed the shift immediately, her decades of quiet observation attuning her to details others missed entirely. She found Elena at the farmer's market one morning, examining a basket of apples with more focus than the task really required, her mind clearly elsewhere. You're not as safe as you were a week ago, Grace said without preamble, falling into step beside her. I can see it in the way your shoulders sit. in the way that man of yours watches the tree line now, instead of just watching you. Elena glanced at her, surprised by the older woman's directness. You know more than you let on, don't you, Grace? I know enough, Grace said simply. Enough to recognize the signs when trouble comes looking for a place like this. My grandmother used to say, the old families brought their storms with them wherever they went, even when they didn't mean to. Doesn't make the storm any less real once it arrives. I'm not running from it, Elena said, setting the basket of apples down and meeting Grace's steady gaze directly. Whatever's coming, I'd rather face it here, in the open, than spend another year hiding from a threat I can't even see. Grace studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind her sharp eyes. Good, she said finally, because I don't think hiding was ever really an option for someone like you, dear. Some people are built to weather storms rather than run from them. I suspect you're one of them. She patted Elena's arm gently before moving off toward another stall, leaving Elena standing alone amid the bustle of the market, her hand resting protectively over her stomach as she watched the older woman disappear into the crowd. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the hills, Cade received word that changed the careful calculations he'd been making all week. Damon Voss himself had been spotted less than 50 miles from town, traveling not with a war party, but with a small, formal delegation, the kind typically reserved for diplomatic negotiations rather than open conflict. He's not coming to attack, Cade said slowly, reading the report with careful attention. He's coming to negotiate, or more likely, to be seen negotiating, while he tests exactly how far he can push before I'm forced to respond. What does that mean for us? Elena asked, watching the tension in Cade's shoulders with growing unease. It means, Cade said, setting the report aside and turning to face her fully, that Voss intends to arrive in this town, in the open, and force a confrontation that the entire pack world will be watching closely. He wants an audience for whatever comes next, Elena, and he wants you standing in the middle of it when it happens. Damon Voss arrived in town 3 days later, on a cold, clear morning that made the whole street feel unusually quiet, as though the town itself sensed something significant was about to unfold. He came with only 6 men beside him, dressed plainly, deliberately unthreatening, though Elena felt the tension radiating from Cade the moment the black cars rolled to a stop outside the town hall. Cade had arranged the meeting there, on neutral ground, insisting that whatever conversation needed to happen would happen in the open, witnessed by the town itself, rather than hidden away where rumors could twist the truth beyond recognition. Elena stood beside him on the town hall steps, her hand resting in his, her chin lifted despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Voss stepped out of the lead car with an easy, practiced smile, the kind of expression that revealed nothing genuine beneath its polished surface. He was leaner than Cade, sharper featured, with pale gray eyes that swept over the small gathered crowd with cool, assessing interest before finally settling on Elena. So this is her, Voss said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet street. The human who's caused so much conversation among the packs. I confess, I expected someone more remarkable. Careful, Voss, Cade said, his voice low and even, though the warning beneath it was unmistakable. You came here to talk. Let's talk, and leave the insults for men who need them to feel powerful. Voss's smile flickered, a brief crack in his composed exterior before he smoothed it over again. Fair enough, he said. I came to discuss the matter of succession. An heir born to a human mate raises questions among the old families, Cade. Questions about legitimacy, about whether the bloodlines that have governed us for centuries still mean anything at all. The bloodlines mean exactly what they've always meant, Cade said. Strength, loyalty, the ability to protect what belongs to you. My son will be born with all 3, regardless of his mother's origins. Pretty words, Voss said, glancing again at Elena with an expression that made her skin crawl slightly, though she refused to look away. But words alone won't satisfy packs who've spent generations believing certain lines shouldn't be crossed. Some of my allies wonder whether an alpha who breaks tradition so openly can still be trusted to lead with the old wisdom intact. Then your allies are welcome to test that wisdom themselves, Cade said, his voice hardening slightly. Though I'd remind you, and them, that I've led my territory through 3 decades without a single challenger surviving long enough to regret their decision to test me. A ripple of tension moved through the small crowd gathered at a careful distance, though most residents had no real understanding of the true stakes behind the exchange, only sensing, instinctively, that something significant hung in the balance. Elena felt Cade's hand tighten slightly around hers, a silent reassurance amid the mounting tension. Voss studied Cade for a long moment, his easy smile finally slipping away entirely, revealing something colder and more calculating beneath it. "I didn't come here for a fight, Cade. I came to see for myself whether the rumors held any truth, whether you'd truly gone soft, distracted by a human mate, while your borders grow vulnerable." "And what have you seen?" Cade asked evenly. Voss's gaze moved slowly over the scene before him, the quiet strength in Elena's posture, the unwavering loyalty visible in the small crowd that had gathered despite understanding little of what was truly happening, the absolute certainty radiating from Cade himself, undiminished by whatever softness love might have brought into his life. "I've seen enough," Voss said finally, his voice carrying a reluctant note of respect he clearly hadn't expected to feel. "Enough to understand that whatever weakness I hope to find here doesn't exist, not in the way I imagined." "Then we understand each other," Cade said. "I have no interest in conflict with your pack, Voss, but I will not tolerate further attempts to test my borders, or to use Elena as leverage in whatever games you're playing with the other packs. My son will be born safely, in peace, or he will be born amid a war that ends with your territory absorbed into mine. The choice belongs to you." Voss held his gaze for a long, tense moment, some final calculation working behind his pale eyes before he finally nodded, once, sharply. "Peace then," he said, "for now." He turned without further ceremony and walked back toward his waiting car, his men falling into step behind him with the same practiced, unhurried grace they'd arrived with. Within minutes, the black cars pulled away from the town hall, disappearing down the main road and out of town, leaving behind a silence that gradually gave way to murmured conversation among the small crowd who'd witnessed the exchange without fully understanding its significance. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, the tension slowly draining from her shoulders as Cade turned to face her fully. "It's over?" she asked quietly. "For now," Cade said, echoing Voss's own words, though his tone carried far more certainty. Men like Voss rarely give up entirely, but he understands now that whatever weakness he hoped to exploit doesn't exist. That should buy us peace for a long while. Long enough, I hope, to see our son safely into the world. Grace Whitfield watched the entire exchange from the edge of the crowd, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, every unspoken tension that had passed between the two alphas on the town hall steps. She allowed herself a small, satisfied nod, feeling the old instincts that had guided her quiet observations these past weeks finally settle into something like relief. Word of the confrontation spread through town over the following days, growing more exaggerated with each retelling, until most residents believed they'd witnessed something far more dramatic than the careful, restrained negotiation that had actually taken place. But beneath the exaggeration, the town understood something true and important. Elena Reyes had returned home, not as someone to be pitied or mocked, but as a woman, standing at the center of something far larger than anyone had initially realized, protected fiercely by a man whose quiet strength had silenced even his fiercest rival. Marcus Kellen heard the story secondhand, from customers at his uncle's shop who spoke of it in hushed, awed tones, and felt a strange mixture of relief and humility settle over him. Whatever danger he had unknowingly provoked in that grocery store aisle weeks ago, he understood now, with startling clarity, exactly how fortunate he had been that his cruelty had cost him nothing more than embarrassment and a difficult apology. 2 months later, on a quiet evening in early winter, Elena gave birth to a healthy son, surrounded by her mother, by Cade, and by a small circle of trusted pack members who had traveled from Cade's territory to witness the arrival of their future alpha. They named him Ronan, a name Cade explained meant little seal or small strong one in old family tradition, fitting for a child born into peace, hard-won through patience rather than violence. Grace Whitfield sent a small, hand-knitted blanket to the house shortly after the birth, a quiet gesture that Elena treasured deeply, understanding it as an acknowledgement of the strange, unspoken bond that had formed between them over the preceding months. The old woman never fully explained how she'd come to understand so much about packs and alphas and old family laws, and Elena never pressed her for details, grateful simply for the quiet wisdom and support Grace had offered when it mattered most. As for Marcus, He kept his distance in the months that followed, though occasionally, when their paths crossed in town, he offered Elena a small, genuine nod of respect, free of the bitterness or performance that had once colored every interaction between them. He had learned, in the end, a lesson far more valuable than he could have imagined that afternoon in the grocery store, that cruelty offered freely often returns tenfold, and that true strength rarely needs to announce itself loudly to be recognized. Elena Reyes stood on the porch of her childhood home, one crisp morning, her son cradled gently in her arms, watching the sun rise slowly over the hills that had witnessed every chapter of her difficult, transformative journey. Cade joined her a moment later, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, pressing a soft kiss to the top of their son's head. "No more storms for a while," Elena said quietly, leaning into his warmth. "No more storms," Cade agreed, though something in his tone suggested he understood, as she did, that peace was never truly permanent, only earned again and again through patience, strength, and the quiet refusal to be made small by those who mistook cruelty for power. Behind them, the town continued its slow, ordinary rhythm, unaware that within its quiet streets lived a woman who had weathered humiliation, danger, and old-world politics with unwavering grace, and a son who would one day inherit a legacy built not on fear, but on the fierce, unshakable love of two people who had refused to let anyone, human or otherwise, convince them they didn't belong together. The morning light stretched golden across the porch, warm and steady, promising, at least for now, a peace that had been fought for, earned, and finally, fully claimed.